begin with a few opening comments. So some of you may know that this was the year where the Christian Reformed Church in North America commemorates, remembers, celebrates the 25th anniversary of ordaining women in the offices. That's right, in the offices of minister of the word, commissioned pastor, and elder. So, we had hoped that we would have some in-person events this year. That unfortunately didn't happen. So we pivoted. And one of the things that we did was we invited Ellen Duffield to join us in April. It was back in April when we had our first webinar with Ellen. And we talked about voice and using our voice and how our voices have developed as women in ministry primarily. At everyone, like we had a similar Zoom room, close to probably 60 people, 60 women attended that event as well. And what we found coming out of that is this deep desire to continue the conversation. We heard from women that of that experience, wow, I realized that I'm not alone. The feelings that I am experiencing in ministry are shared experiences by other women in ministry. And we knew that we had both discovered and started something that we wanted to continue. And that was continuing to network women who have shared experiences and women in ministry. So we did some small groups in June around Ellen's book. And we thought, what better way to close out the year of anniversary than to bring her back and now talk about power. This is a conversation that we don't often have. We're either uncomfortable with having power, or we complain about not being given the power that we think we deserve, or there's this awkward conversation right now in our culture around power. So might there be some shame that's around who has it and who doesn't, and what happens when you do? We're going to have a great conversation today. Our desire is to see all of you gain awareness about your role in developing your personal power. And so I'm just thrilled and honored to host this event. I'm Elaine May, and I'm the Women's Leadership Developer for the Christian Reformed Church in North America. And I'm joined by Leslie Van Milligan, who introduced us to Ellen back in April, and she's co-hosting this webinar with me. Leslie, why don't you say a few things about yourself and then give us a few more orientating comments.
Sure. Thank you, Elaine. I work for Faith Formation Ministries in the Christian Reformed Church. I come alongside congregations to help them with their cradle to grave faith formation initiatives. And it's a real honor to be with you all this morning. We're trying really hard to make this as interactive as possible. So I've given you a slide deck that you can work in. And at the end, you'll be able to have a copy of this so that you have notes and you'll be able to have listened in on conversations throughout, since we're a large group. But if you're not able to access it right now, don't worry, we'll give you access to it later as well. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that we're going to, towards the end, give you an opportunity with some live links. So even if you don't want to work in the slide deck now, it might be worthwhile having it open. Just to get our kind of heads around what it is that we're talking about today, Elaine is going to put in a poll asking this question: does the word power generate positive, negative, or neutral associations for you? So we're going to let Elaine put those in.
You guys see, do you see the poll? Some of you have been answering it as you've come in. Great. I also want to give a shout out to, we have women joining us from the CRC, but also from the RCA and from the ECC, the Evangelical Covenant. So welcome. We're so glad that you've joined the conversation. We're thrilled that you're here. Oh.
Can you re-put up the poll? Some people are saying in the chat that they don't see it.
Okay, let me try this again. Hold on a second.
I also know.
Let's try this again. I'm going to relaunch it all together. So
Perfect.
if you chose one of those answers, please do it again.
How does the word power make you feel? Positive, negative, or neutral?
Elaine, you want us to do it again, even if we
Yes.
answer? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh my goodness, this is so interesting.
We will share the results. Leslie can
Yes.
see the results. That's why she's saying it's interesting. But we'll share the, yeah, they don't see the results, I don't think, as you are answering.
I got to go back to the slide deck. The simplest way to access the slide deck is to take the link in the chat and open another window on your computer, and then you'll see all the stuff that's in the slide deck itself. You all have editing access. So that also means we have to be careful what we click.
All right, we've got about 86% of you have answered. You got a few more coming in.
Some of you did put your names and stuff because you weren't able to get into the slide deck, and I will put them later into the slide deck, but I can't keep up with it now.
All right, here you go. Leslie, what do you see? Whoa!
We're almost evenly divided in thirds. 34% positive, 32% negative, and 34% neutral. That's amazing. So it shows us, I think, that we're a bit conflicted about the word power and how power is used, how it's experienced, how we use it and experience it.
Fascinating.
So I'm going to pass it on to my good friend Ellen as she kind of takes what we've just shared with her and talks about Jesus and power. Ellen, I have known Ellen for about 12, 13 years now. I've worked with her she's trained me in next level leadership, which is a kind of a collaborative group of women who are trying to look at leadership from more of a female approach, as opposed to the typical capital L, large and in charge leadership that comes out of the business world and often is very male oriented. I'm not man bashing, but it just has a different flavor to it. And Ellen has done a great job to help women say, well, what is it that we bring to this conversation that can help us to understand and claim our own power and to use it in a way that blesses. Ellen is now at Briarcrest College and Seminary, and maybe just give us a snippet of what your new work is, Ellen, because that's a shift from the last time we had you here. Yeah. My friend Ellen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so great to see everyone. And for those of you who were on the call back in the spring, at that point, I had no idea that I was going to be let go this past summer from the role that I was in. And that started a whole series of changes, which included us moving from Ontario, Canada to Saskatchewan. And that's a big shift culturally. And we have loved the move so far. We've just been here for 3 weeks. And I'm actually sitting in our rental house here in Saskatchewan. So for those of you who have made, a significant move like that, what's involved in that. And my new role is in support of the Masters of Leadership and Management offerings that are offered through Briarcrest Seminary. And 50% of my time is supporting the students and faculty there and doing some teaching. And then 50% of my time is working with the broader church community. And so I may be tapping some of your shoulders to hear what some of the needs are and maybe some ways that we could even work together on some things in the future. So delighted to be here. Thank you. And as Leslie mentioned, I'm really excited about being able to talk about this topic today. I can honestly say that of the many books that I've read over the last 20 years, the book that we're going to be talking about today has been one of the most profoundly impactful for me. And what it did is it really caused me to go back and take a close look at my worldview around this whole issue of power. And of course, therefore, to go back and to really take a look at what scripture teaches about power, and specifically what Jesus teaches about power. And so I thought I would start us off by reading from a little article that I found just recently in the Anglican Journal of Canada from Archbishop Mark MacDonald. And he talks about this very thing, Jesus and power. And he says, when the early followers of Jesus proclaimed that he was ruler of all things, Lord of all, they were pointing towards an understanding of authority and power, which seems far from the world that we currently live in. So far that some wondered if describing Jesus as a sovereign above all else is a contradiction to the character of his life and teaching. So I want you to think about that. Then he goes on to say, as Jesus taught us, the sovereignty of God that he embodies is abiding and growing in creation and history towards the renewal of all things. This kingdom or reign of God is not easy for people to see. It is not even easy for us to notice, though it is intimate to every moment and every movement of life. As it unveils its power in Jesus, it mocks all other forms of power. They are just pretending. They do not know what true power is. They blaspheme the power of love that is the power of God. Jesus asked his followers to live in the manner of God's sovereignty and power, which he now embodies through the cross and resurrection. In this way, his disciples hasten the coming of a new heaven and a new earth, no longer hypnotized by the grotesque cartoon power of tyrants, money, and image. This is our calling. It calls us to the overwhelming healing of Jesus, but it also calls us to endure the challenging opposition that he faced from the false powers that seek to inhabit and destroy our world. Isn't that insightful? I'm happy to send that to you so that you can read it. I had to read it about 5 times myself before I even began to wrap my head around it. But I just thought it was a good way for us to begin to think about this topic of power, because the Bible is saturated with power encounters right from the beginning to the end. And I would like to suggest that probably your days are saturated with power encounters as well. You know, you might be young enough to have a couple of young 2-year-olds in your household who have learned the word no already. You might have some teenagers in your family who fight over dinner times or bedtimes. You might have challenges with the remote if you're still using a remote with your TV. You might be in board meetings in which the issue of power comes up. You may be engaged in conversations in which this is an undergirding theme. Power is pervasive and invasive. And that's why I think it's so important for us to think about it. We know that Jesus told us that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. And then he commissions us to go in his name. We know, for example, in Ephesians 1, that he is seated at the right hand of the Father, far above all other power and authority. We know that we are given incredible authority in Scripture. In fact, if you study the book of Luke or the book of Mark, you see all of these examples in which God's disciples, God's followers are given authority, are given power. For example, in Luke 10:19, we're given authority to tread on serpents and over the power of the enemy. In Ephesians 2, it even says that we are seated in the heavenly places with Jesus, suggesting this divine authority and power that we are given in Jesus' name. And yet, when we come to Mark 10:42, we read this very important passage. It's probably the only time that Jesus speaks directly to this issue of leadership. And he says, the rulers of this world lord it over one another. It shall not be so with you. And so we see that we are given authority and power in a number of realms. And generally speaking, we kind of shy away from that. But there's one place where humans are not to have authority and power over one another. They're not to lord it over one another. And that is the one place where we long to hold on to it. And I don't know about you, but this has been such a huge and insightful and powerful piece for me in realizing just how much I correctly and incorrectly access the power that I have. And how I often am not even aware of what I'm doing and how intentional we need to be. And it's caused me to ask myself the question, does the fact that I am not intentionally abusing my power justify the fact that I am not intentionally using it well? I just leave you with that question to think about. Because the fact is, as we'll soon see, we all do have certain kinds of power. We have designated power that we get from Jesus. We also have power as a result of our person and our personhood and our privilege. So I'm going to ask Leslie if she would share a slide that shows a model that was developed by Janet Hagberg. Has anyone read Stages of Power in Organizations by Janet Hagberg? Love to see. This book has been one of the most profound books in my learning, as I said. Came across it some 20 years ago, and it still continues to be incredibly important to me. And Janet would draw what she describes as 6 stages of power. Now, you might not like stage theory. I understand that. Think of it as we're on a journey, and there are different kind of waypoints along the journey. And I want to make it clear that Janet would say that we have all 6 of these stages within us at all times, but we tend to access them more or less depending on a number of factors. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So stage 1, as you can see, is a stage of powerlessness. We're all born into the world pretty much powerless. We have some power in the sense that when we cry, hopefully someone responds to that, and we learn how to use that power. But candidly, some children are born into the world and they cry and no one does respond to that. And so they learn that they have very limited power. Now, most people are able to move on. As I said already, by age 2, we've learned how to use some of our power, but most people are able to move on. But those who are caught in abject poverty or systemic abuse or have significant trauma in their lives, for many people like that, they can get stuck in stage 1 in a sense of powerlessness. No ability to change their situation, no ability to influence those around them. And that is a really scary place to be. But remember, I mentioned that all of us have all of these stages within us. So there are times when every one of us, and I should speak for myself, where I am acting out of stage 1, even though I came from a relatively healthy childhood. We go back to stage 1 every time that we feel powerless. So when we step into a new job, as I did just recently 3 weeks ago, when we step into a conversation with someone who we feel a bit intimidated by, where someone says something that kind of rattles us, and makes us feel less confident. At any number of points throughout the day, we can step back into that sense of powerlessness. And here's what happens when we do. We respond out of that sense of powerlessness in a very defensive kind of way. We want to protect ourselves because that's a very uncomfortable feeling. And so what we'll often do is we'll try to manipulate. We don't know how to address things head on. So we'll do some passive aggressive stuff, or we'll do some hiding, or we'll do some stuff that's really quite counterproductive in order to protect ourselves and to make ourselves feel safe. We'll push others down so that we feel elevated. Whenever we find ourselves tempted to do those kinds of things, it's probably an indication we just jumped back into 1. But for many of us, most of the time, we're able to move on to at least stage 2, power by association. Power by association, Janet would describe as when we are able to identify that we have some people kind of that we can use to help us feel more powerful, or some positions that we can use, or something external that we can use. So this would be the my dad's stronger than your dad kind of language that we sometimes experienced as a child. This would be the, well, my boss says, or my pastor said, or when I went to seminary, Dr. So-and-so said. Anytime that we are allocating our opinion, our voice, our power, designating it by attaching it to someone who is perceived as powerful, or externalizing our own power, that's called power by association. Now, by no means am I saying that we shouldn't give credit to other people, nor am I saying that we shouldn't try to help people associate with each other, and that we draw people together and network people so that there's strength in numbers. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is when our personal power is so weakened, so fragile, so wounded, that we have to attach someone else's name to it. It's said in this book, I read in this paper, whatever it might be. That's when we realize, hey, I've just stepped back into stage 2. Now, here's the interesting thing about Janet's research. She discovered that many women get stuck in stage 2 because candidly, it's a safer place to be. When the buck doesn't have to stop here, when we can kind of pass it on up the line, so to speak, it helps us to feel more secure. And so for many people, the thought of having to go to stage 3 for reasons which I'll describe in a moment is not that attractive. And so we would rather stay as faithful followers. And let me just say, there is nothing wrong with being a faithful follower. There is nothing wrong with operating out of stage 2 at certain points of our life. In fact, there's nothing wrong with any of these stages. Power by achievement or status is really about someone's competency. In order to move from one stage to another, we have to let go of something, we have to gain something. To move from 2 to 3, we have to let go of some security, because it's scary to move into stage 3. And so we have to pick up some skills, some credibility, some competencies in order to compensate for what we're losing. And so as we move into stage 3, we actually generally become more confident. And so a lot of us, especially, and you know what, my book's called Brave, so it suggests that we're moving towards confidence, and there is something about that. But the way that many of us gain confidence is by gaining competencies and credibility. And so anything that is, we have achieved, so I have such and such a degree, or I am in this position, or we used to work at a camp and it would be things like, I have access to a golf cart, or I have keys to such and such a building, whatever it is that gives us like, woo, look at me, I'm something because I've got this. This can be that I'm tall and have a commanding voice when I walk into the room and people look at me. It can be that I dress well. It can be anything that would cause me to feel kind of shored up in my own personal power. It's something that I've achieved or something that I have, but it's all external stuff. Now, here's the scary part about her research. Her research would suggest that not only do many leaders get stuck at stage 3, but also that this is what most organizations, including churches, are looking for in their leaders. I'm just going to let that pin drop for a moment as you look at the fact that we are not yet halfway around the circle. We are wanting confident, competent, charismatic, stage 3 leaders. And yet, Janet would suggest that real leadership does not even begin until at least stage 4. To move from stage 3 to stage 4, we have to let go of some things again. And why would we want to? Because stage 3 is where we are being acknowledged. We're getting the big stages. We're getting our books published. Our name is getting mentioned in articles. We're being quoted. We're being invited to participate in conversations. We are being given a bigger office. We're being given a bigger paycheck, all of those kinds of things. Why would we want to move on? We have arrived in terms of leadership. We have a big social media following, whatever those things might be. All of that stuff, nothing wrong with it, except that it is still only at stage 3. And so generally speaking, in order to give some of that stuff up, which we're going to have to do in order to move forward, generally speaking, something has to happen that disrupts our world a little bit. This is what sometimes used to be described as the success to significance movement or midlife crisis, or when something happens in your world that kind of shakes your foundations a little bit and you're like, is this what it's all about? And now, although it might sound like I'm describing the realities outside the church and Christian ministries, in fact, this would be just as prevalent in those circles as well. Because in order to move from 3 to 4, which is power by reflection, we begin to go inside. And I just want to make it clear that this is a journey that anyone can go on. This is not just for like the mystics and the introverts amongst us who are good at kind of already going inside. This is a journey that any of us can go on, but that each of our journeys will look different. It will be unique to who we are. But as we do begin to do that internal journey, some people describe it as deconstruction. Some people describe it as their world falling apart, any number of different descriptions of this internal journey, because it's often provoked by pain or discomfort, disequilibrium in some way in our lives. And what happens is we begin to question some things. Some of the stuff that we just took for granted, we begin to question. Some of the accolades that we've been receiving, we begin to go, do I even really want to be known for that? And the way that you can tell if someone is at stage 4 is very subtle. Because someone at stage 4 is the kind of person that sitting around a table, they may or may not even have any kind of position of authority at the table. But when a question is asked that is kind of like a deep question, or where there's a lot of trust required, you'll see all the heads around the table turn to that person. Because that is the person that is a little bit more real and authentic. That's the person who is a little bit more transparent. That's the person who's not going to compromise their values quite as much. That's the person that is trusted. And whereas people in stage 3 are often asked to be mentors and coaches, can you help me? It's because I want to be like you and achieve what you're achieving. People in stage 4 will often be asked, can I just hang out with you? I don't even know what I want from you. I just want some of you to rub off on me. There's something different about you. Now, here's the other piece that's important for us to know about this theory. We can understand people who are in the same stage that we're in and those that are before us because we've lived through those. We have to live through those in order to move on. Many of us would prefer to jump from 2 to 4, but the fact is we can't. We have to go through 3. You have to land on that branch, so to speak, find out how fragile that branch is, and then fly off from it. So we can understand those stages that have come before. We can understand our own. We can kind of understand one that's just one stage ahead of us, someone who's functioning out of that a good part of the time. But what we cannot really get is somebody who's 2 stages ahead of us, because their thinking and their behavior is so different and, quite candidly, so threatening to us. And so this is where it's difficult in organizations to create environments in which all 6 stages are safe. Because what tends to happen is that we need the leaders in 4 and even 5 and 6, which we're going to talk about later. But it's hard for us to create the kinds of environments where they can thrive, especially if we personally are at stage 2 or 3, or the organization is at 2 or 3. It is difficult to create organizations that function at 4, 5, and 6, especially if we have targets that we have to hit, and if we feel like we have competitors, all of those kinds of things. And so it's important for us to realize that we have all of these stages within us, but we have a place where we tend to feel most comfortable at this point in our journey. She calls that our home stage. We keep coming back to that. So if I'm at stage 3 at this point in my journey, a good part of the time. That doesn't mean that there aren't moments when I'm functioning from 5 or 6. And it doesn't mean that there's not moments where I'm jumping back to 1 or 2. Or maybe at home I'm in 2, but at work I'm in 3, or vice versa. So this is a fluid model. It's not meant to lock us in and say, oh, well, I can peg that person because they're clearly at 3. In fact, the biggest danger of showing this model to people is that almost all of us identify as being at 4, or when I describe them later, 5 or 6. And almost all of us will be tempted to identify our boss at being at 3, and often our spouse or significant other. And that may be true, but it may also not be true, or not quite as true as we think it is. In fact, Janet would say when we begin to say, hey, I'm at 6 or I'm at 5, it's a pretty good indicator that we probably aren't. So I just say that with some gentleness to say, just be careful not to peg yourself too much. But this model, as I mentioned before, has really helped me in a number of ways. And one of the ways that has helped is for myself and working with others, helping to understand that it's actually normal for us to go through some changes in the way that we think about power and the way that we think about ourselves. Because in fact, as we move from stage 4, power by reflection, through what Janet calls the wall, which I'll describe in a moment, it might feel to us like our world is falling apart. And in reality, many parts of our inner world are falling apart at the wall. And that's why it's so painful. And so knowing that this is actually a God-ordained opportunity for us to grow and shift and be transformed can help us, even though it's still going to be super, super painful. Because at the wall, people often think that they're losing their faith. They often think that they have lost their minds. They often think that they're going to have to quit their job or leave their spouse or any number of very significant changes. And some of those things may be true. You may need to change your job, for example. But generally speaking, this is not about any of that external stuff. We want to make it about that external stuff because that is stuff that we can change and control. It is actually about internal stuff. It is about how deep we are willing to go with a God who calls out to us deep to deep. It's about how vulnerable we are willing to be with our small circle of trusted advisors. It's about how comfortable we can become with being uncomfortable and living in paradox for a while and living with uncertainty for a while. And because many of us hate that, we're going to avoid what I'm just going to describe, and we're going to go jumping back to 3. We tend not to go back to 4 because 4 is like the edge of sliding into the wall, and we don't like that. And so instead we jump back to 3 because 3 is the secure place. It's the place where I'm confident. It's the place where people look to me. It's the place where I'm the answer giver. And I like that. I like being there. It feels safer for me there. 4 and especially 5 and 6 are a lot less safe. So the wall can be anything. It can be one event or a series of events that shakes our world, that pulls the rug out from under us. It's often associated with some kind of emotional pain, but often it's associated with shame as well. Disillusionment, deep discouragement. Now, I need to be very careful about this because everyone goes through really hard things. And you can have 2 people who are going through exactly the same type of thing, and one of them will be moving from 4 to 5, and one of them will actually be in 1 or 2 internally. So this is not about, what I'm about to describe sounds like I'm describing external things, but it's actually about what's happening within us as a result of often external things. So we lose our job, we lose a loved one. Something profound happens that we never expected, or something happens to our children that we who are like, we didn't raise our kids to be like this, or we never anticipated that this could have happened under our leadership, or I can't believe that people betrayed me in this way, or some combination of those kinds of things. Personal health issues, any issues, external issues, deep and profound issues can trigger this deep and profound inner response, but they don't necessarily. And this is why not everyone goes through the wall. In fact, if we were to look at the number of people in each of the stages, we would see a significant number of people that are at stage 2, a significant number of people that are at stage 3, a smaller number at stage 4, and then generally speaking, much smaller in 5 and 6. Because the wall is exactly that. It is impenetrable. It is the kind of thing that we think there's no way I'm ever going to get through this. You can't go around it. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You got to go through it. And the wall is something that is both external and internal to us. And somehow we intuitively know that on the other side of the wall, things are going to be different. We are going to have to be different. In fact, we are going to have to be much more self-sacrificing, much more deeply spiritual, much more deeply loving, less dependent on our own needs being met. And I'm not talking about not meeting our genuine needs, but just less focus on it being about me. Because the wall is all about the crucifixion of our ego, the unhealthy parts of our ego. And so you can see it's a gift from the Lord for us to go through the wall, but it feels like anything but a gift because it hurts, excuse my language, but I'm using it intentionally, like hell. It doesn't feel like a gift from heaven. It feels like something from hell. And I'm not saying that hell doesn't also contribute in this, because of course we do have an enemy, and the enemy loves to get in there when we are going through hard times and loves to exaggerate things and take advantage of things. So there are sometimes components of that are going on. But the point of this is that at the wall, we have choices. We have choices to go deep into who we are and who we believe God is calling us to be. We have choices to be real about what we're going through and share in appropriate ways with appropriate people, which is really important. This is not the kinds of things we share with people at stage 1 and 2, for example. But we find trusted advisors who are at 4 and 5. We go to counselors and spiritual directors who are able to help us. And as we do this, we discover that somehow, impossible to us, but nothing being impossible to God, somehow we are able to move through what we thought we were never going to be able to move through. And then we begin to move into what she calls power by purpose. So people who are motivated by power by purpose are along the journey towards wisdom. They are getting closer and closer to that stage 6, power by wisdom. As I mentioned, they are people who are often very humble. They are not likely to draw attention to themselves. They're not likely to want positions of power or any trappings of kind of worldly power as we think of it. They are often very self-effacing. So if you were to say to them, hey, can you speak at this event or whatever? 10 years ago, when I was in stage 3, I would have been like, rah, give me $10,000 and I'll come. But now if someone's at stage 5, they probably are going to be thinking, I don't know that I really have anything to say to that. And they're not being falsely humble. They've just come to a different place. So they're much more likely to be the listeners in the room. They're much more likely to be the ones who just kind of say these 1 or 2 small words and you go, whoa, didn't think of it that way. They're much more likely to be comfortable with paradox and very different points of view. As I mentioned earlier, more deeply spiritual, more deeply loving, more truly service-oriented, self-emptying, beginning to follow in the pathway of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, loving and giving to one another. This is only possible by the work of God in our lives. This is not something that we can achieve, nor can we speed it up. So I might be in 1 when I wake up in the morning and go, okay, give me some coffee because I got to jump to 5. That's not going to do it. This is the work of the Spirit in our lives. as we surrender and surrender and allow God to transform us. And it takes time. There may be some 21-year-olds who are at stage 5. It's more likely that there are some 50 and 60 and 70 and 80-year-olds who are at stage 5, because these journeys take time. Now, we will all, as I keep saying, have stage 5 and 6 moments throughout our day. But generally speaking, we will have a home stage where we feel more comfortable, and we'll go back to that. Stage 6 would represent a fairly small group of people, as you can imagine. These are the kind of Mother Teresas of the world who have come to represent something much bigger than themselves. Yeah, and I agree, tea is much more helpful than coffee in moving to stage 5. These are the Mother Teresas of the world who we look to and we see there's something about them. This is this tiny little woman who stands up at the White House, you may recall a number of years ago when she was alive, and said, if you don't want your unborn children, send them to me. Like the authority of her voice. But it was because she had given power away. And this is the deep irony of this. We become so much more powerful as we give power away. Now, I mentioned Mother Teresa just because we know her. There are many stage 6 people who are completely unknown because they fly under the radar by intention and by design. They do not want to be highlighted. However, they are willing to be highlighted if that moves forward the cause. And that's the difference between Mother Teresa. She was willing to get on a plane and go and stand in front of presidents because of unborn children. She wasn't doing it for any reason within herself. And that's the big difference. So you will see people doing exactly the same kind of work, the same kinds of interviews, the same kinds of things. And they might be at stage 5 or stage 3, and it might be difficult to tell. But on the inside, the reason they're doing it and the dependence that they have on God in order to be able to do it, and the outcomes of what will happen as a result of them doing it will be very, very different. I realize I'm giving like a high-level flyby of this, and normally we would spend a day, even 2 days, just digging into this. But hopefully it's beginning to give us some insights and maybe even inspiring you to read this book or to reach out to one of us and to dig into it a little bit deeper. But I just wanted to point out that we follow a Savior who understood that the way to power was through powerlessness. And I want to read to you from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And I don't know how much you've reflected on the cross and the resurrection recently, but when we think about this, Jesus was never more powerful than when he hung on a cross and to the world looked completely powerless. We are talking about a rock-splitting, veil-ripping, universe-shaping, history-breaking moment in time. My hair is standing on end as I even talk about it now. I'm getting emotional. That's what the cross and resurrection did. A man hanging on a cross changed everything. And this is why Mark McDonald's article is so profound, because we've lost touch with what power really means. And we, the church, are abusing power, and we are abdicating power in the very day when the world needs us to smarten up. Is it okay if I say that? We need to smarten up about this. We need to tap into who God is. We need to tap into what it means to be the people of God in a world that needs him. And that's why it's important for us to understand power and to understand where we're at in our own development, because at certain places in our own development, it will be too much about us. And we need to be open to allowing God to move us and help us to grow towards wisdom, towards love, towards the release of our egos in healthy ways and according to his timing. so that we can create the kinds of environments where others can do the same thing, so that we can create the kinds of communities where children can grow up knowing what it means to be loved, where families can thrive, where communities can support businesses. All of these kinds, they're all connected. It's all connected. It's incredibly and powerfully important. And then the other piece that's super important for us is to learn how to work with people who are at different stages than us. Because you might be at stage 4, and maybe you have some people who are at stage 2, and you look at them and you're wondering, how do we help them to grow? Okay, they're not going to jump from 2 to 4. They have to go through 3. So you have to help them to move towards 3. But they're not going to jump from 2 to 3. They're going to go from 2 to 2.1 to 2.2 to 2.3. So we're going to need some developmental opportunities to help them to grow. But then we don't want to leave them under the leadership of stage 3 people for too long, do we? Because that becomes normative. It is too attractive. It is seductive. It is like cocaine. So we need to expose them frequently and confidently to people who have other ways of thinking, and help our young people especially, to know that there are other ways of living and leading, more collaborative ways, more God-honoring ways to do this. But then if we're in stage 3, quite candidly, we like the stage 2 people, because we need some loyal people who are just going to kind of come along and tell us we're doing great and carry our bags. And I don't know about you, I shouldn't speak for you, but I've been there. I like it when people tell me how great I am. I like it when people are saying, wherever you go, I'll go with you. I like that. That feeds some kind of ego need for me. We need to be really careful about that. And then you may be in a stage where you are working with someone who really and genuinely is in stage 3, and you're just banging your head against the wall. If you truly are at 4 or 5 or 6, you will not be angry at that person. You will have compassion for them because you have been there. And you will know how seductive it is. And you will know that they need the power equivalent of an AA meeting in order to get out of that. It's a whole different approach to thinking about people in power, who they are, where they're at, what they need, and how we can genuinely serve them, isn't it? So we want to give you some time to go into some breakout groups. We have just fire hosed you with information, some of which you may have heard before, some of which might be new. So now we want to give you a chance to process and to think. So Elaine, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Welcome back. I know it just probably took some of you mid-sentence. Welcome back. So please, jump into that slide that associates with your breakout room and enter some of it. We are getting some questions and some reflection, particularly on the impact of this model on gender or people of color. And I want to invite Ellen to advance our learning in that regard as well. So Ellen, back to you for a few moments on that.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say that when it comes to talking about this model, it is a very complex conversation. And there are so many really important and nuanced ways that we could dive into this if we had more time. But just to give a very high level comment, definitely I would say that according to Janet's research, at least, that because of the way that women have been socialized in many parts of the world, it is much more challenging for women to even move into stage 3, which we need to do in order to be able to move into the other stages. And part of the reason for that is because women will be perceived as being bossy, or some other words that start with B, which we won't mention here, as they do that. And so that can be a real challenge for many women. Now, when we layer on top of that the intersectionality of race or lived experience or the family that we came from, or the opportunities that we had. This complicates it so much more. I don't know that it necessarily negates the model, but it almost points to the fact that there are so many other conversations that we need to have here, and in which the model maybe serves as a bit of a jumping off point, but there are deep and important conversations that need to be had around those unique situations that many people face themselves in. The other point I just wanted to make is someone commented on how this is a systemic issue, and nothing could be more true. You know, if we look at the prophets of Baal and Adam and Eve with the apple, like right from the beginning of time, this issue of power has been incredibly powerful and divisive and manipulated, and has caused countless mishaps and major atrocities. And so absolutely from the beginning of time, we see that this is systemic. Having said that, we believe in a God who came to redeem all things. One. Mm-hmm. We believe that we are called as a people to be reconcilers. Number two. So what is the work of the church? What's going on out in the world, that's one thing. We live within that, we influence that. But what's happening within our lives and within our families and within our churches, that's a whole different thing. Paul talks about like what's going on out there, that's okay. But what in here, that is not okay. Certain things that happen out there, that's normative. They are not normative in here. And that's where abuse of power, racism, gendered approaches to things, all these kinds of things, in my opinion, they're not okay in here. They might be happening out there. There might be some reasons for that. We disagree with a lot of those reasons, but is absolutely not okay within here, because we follow a John 17 Savior, right? Who believed in unity, who prayed his high priestly prayer is that we would find ways to create community within diversity. And so I think there's just really powerful conversations we could have here. And I just wish we had more time, and maybe we can create some more time for some of those kinds of conversations, because it is through listening to one another that we'll be able to make any kind of movement forward, I think, in these. Does that kind of address it? I feel so inadequate in addressing this, both because
Thank
of
you, Ellen. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, more conversations for us to have. So certainly appreciate that. This is just a finite conversation right now, but let's continue supporting and encouraging and developing in this understanding. Leslie, you want to take the lead now?
So for those of you who are able and willing to work in the slide deck, slides 33 through 36 have a place for you to share what's one thing or you've learned about that you're excited about today, an aha moment that you're going to lean into moving forward, so that this isn't just an event, we thought about it and we move on. How does what we've talked about here able to be a transformative event and moving us in the right direction? So just pick a Post-it note on any of those slides and tell us what's something you learned today that you're excited about. As I see coming up in the chat, Elaine, an idea for the future is maybe a book club. You saw that?
Yep.
Somebody had also asked, I believe it was Karen Wilkes, said, can we have the quote right in the slide deck? And I've put that quote in the slide deck, or Ellen did. She typed like a mad woman. And because it was a long quote. And then somebody else had asked for one of her first quotes, and that's also been added to the slide deck. Again, you'll have an opportunity to have a copy of the slide deck if you want to go back and look at some of the reflections to help you as you're thinking and moving forward.
Yeah, I want to jump in for a minute, Leslie, and just mention that one of the ways you can help us determine what's next is by completing the feedback form for today's session. So it's in the slide deck on slide 41, but I also put it in the chat. So you can click on that link. It'll open another window in your web browser. If you would take a minute to following the webinar, and give us your ideas. What would be helpful? How can we serve you? How can we help you develop as a leader in your context?
Also in the slide deck is a way to stay connected. We have a leadership cafe the fourth Thursday of every month. There's a live link in that slide if you want to register for that. We get a quarterly newsletter that Elaine puts together for this group. If you'd like to sign up for that, there's a live link in the slide deck, and you can sign up for that as well. Did you want to talk about slide 38?
Yeah,
Elaine?
these are a couple upcoming events that we want to make you aware of. You can join us for any of them. Beth Allison Barr is going to come and talk with our director of Safe Church about her book, and you're welcome to register for that. The link there is in the notes down at the bottom. In January, Rob Dixon, so Liz Testa is here today, my good friend from the RCA, and she introduced me to Rob, who's written a book on Together in Ministry, and he's going to be participating in a webinar in January. Oh, I've read his book now. It's just really, really good. Oh, look at that. Ellen's got a copy too. This too is something that we could follow up and do a book, a book club on. And then I'd love for you to hold the date, save the date. Inspire. So this is a CRCNA conference that will happen in August, the Lord willing, in 2022. That Wednesday night, as a pre-conference event, we're going to have a banquet honoring the 25th anniversary of Women in Ordination. If you're with the ECC or the RCA, come join us, come celebrate with us. Ruth Haley Barton is going to be our keynote speaker that night, and we're also going to hear from people who were instrumental in opening the church to the gifts of women. And that's going to be a fantastic night to remember as well.
If you want a copy of these slides immediately, all you need to do is click on Make a Copy in the last slide, and it will open up that slide deck, and you can make your own copy. That way you have it, you can use it the way that you want to. It's your materials, and it won't impact the original. Also, if you want to find and just quick fill out the feedback form, you can also click here on that last slide, and it will bring you right to the form, and you can do it right away. I'll hand it back to you, Elaine.
Yeah, so it's hard to plug another thing again, but the Leadership Cafe, every month we open a Zoom room. It's the fourth Thursday of the month, and we gather with whoever is available. I think we've probably got about 40 women registered, but we get, maybe 6 to 10 who come every month, and it's different every month, but that is a place for you to, get some encouragement, to check in with other women leaders, continue a conversation of support and encouragement and development. We even met yesterday. We had a conversation about leadership in power in preparation for today. It was so good. And it really, you'll just have to register and show up. That's all I can say. So that registration link is on slide 36. Wow, really good to be with all of you today. I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to be with us.
And thankful that we had sisters from 2 other denominations join us in this conversation as well. You've added such a richness to what we were talking about today. So thank you for joining us.
We really are in this together. And we will, as we all get stronger, right, and more empowered, our influence will expand. And so I just want to speak a blessing over you before you go. and it's been a little while since I've done this because I'm not in pastoral or congregational ministry. So forgive me if I get all the words wrong, but you get the idea, and it's still good. So, my dear sisters and friends, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he turn his face towards you, and may he give you peace, joy, and hope in service as you serve him.